Hi students, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is mitigation banking. Now I realize you probably don't know what we mean by mitigation banking unless maybe you're one of the environmental studies students, but Longwood University is actually involved in this idea of mitigation banking at our Hull Springs farm. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hull Springs farm as well. Now why are we talking about mitigation banking? Well, at this point in our class, we've been talking about command and control strategies for environmental protection, and then we introduced some interesting, more innovative market-based approaches. So we've talked about ITQs with overfishing. We've talked about our tradable pollution allowance program with the EPA for sulfur dioxide. These are both examples of market-based programs. Well, mitigation banking fits right in because it's also a market-based strategy. I think you're going to see that there's a lot of parallels between mitigation banking and what we've learned about ITQs and tradable pollution allowances. So let's get started. We have to begin our journey at Hull Springs Farm because this is where we're actually doing these activities. Now, Hull Springs Farm is located in Westmoreland County in Virginia. And so I've circled that on the map for you. So we're talking about Virginia's northern neck. Now, I'm from Texas. I didn't know anything about the northern neck, so I had to look this up on a map. This is part of Virginia I've never even been to. So in the northern neck, we have Hull Springs Farm, and it sits right on the Chesapeake Bay. If you have the opportunity to go, it's fantastic. You have this beautiful view of the water. It's 662 acres, and on that, we've got 8,400 feet of shoreline and views. Absolutely magnificent. Now, you see the map right here. I've circled on the left the northern neck, right? And so it's sitting right there on the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look at the right, it gives you a little bit zoomed out picture of where this is in Virginia. So I had never been there until last year. Great opportunity for me to see this in person. Now, how did we end up with this farm? 1999, the farm's actually given to Longwood University, and you see some bird's eye view here on the right. Incredible piece of property. It's got this small manor house on it that can be used, and the person who gave it to the university was a 1938 graduate of Longwood. Of course, Longwood wouldn't have been Longwood University back then. Now, her name was Mary Farley Ames Lee, and her goal here was to keep the farm from being developed because this is in a very hot area and it's a lot of land. It could very easily be divided up, become a subdivision, and she wanted to keep that from happening. So she gave it to Longwood University. Now, Hull Springs Farms become a great resource for our institution. For example, the science faculty conducts some research there. I got to go with some of them, and they were testing water quality and doing some research there. They look at species diversity. You see students here on the right doing some hands-on experimentation, lab work. Really great opportunity to do field study. And so students are using the land as a laboratory, and that's a great opportunity for them. But the most interesting part to me about this operation at Hull Springs Farm is that they're involved in environmental economic activities. And so that's what we want to talk about today. What environmental economic activities is Hull Springs Farm, and of course then Longwood University, involved in? That's our topic. Now, this farm is so cool because it's involved in what we call environmental mitigation banking. Environmental mitigation banking. So we're going to talk about the idea of environmental mitigation banking, something that I didn't really know a whole lot about till I started doing some research on this topic after going to Hull Springs Farm. There are 3 different programs that Longwood participates in relation to environmental mitigation banking. So we're involved in programs for, number 1, wetlands. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we mean by a wetland. I know you have a general sense, but we need to have a little bit more specific understanding, so we'll talk about that. There's also an environmental mitigation banking program for streams, so we'll cover that, and finally for nutrients. So Longwood University through Hall Springs Farm is involved in this environmental mitigation banking of wetlands credits, streams, and nutrients. Now these are all programs that are operated by the Commonwealth. So these are state-run programs. So let's start with our first one, and we're going to cover them in this order: wetlands, streams, nutrients. All right, let's get started. Wetlands mitigation. So as I said, there's other kinds of mitigation programs that we're involved in, but I'm going to talk probably mostly about wetlands. And once you understand wetlands, the other ones become easy to understand. And I don't think any of this is going to be hard because we already understand market-based programs through our cap and trade example and ITQs for fishing. So this is going to be really obvious to us. Now, as I'm sure you already understand, in the process of development, wetlands can be impacted, right? Imagine somebody building a complex of houses or apartments. There could be some interference with wetlands. And of course, we don't want that to happen. So this is a program really involving the protection of wetlands. Now, a wetland specifically, so that we all know what we're talking about, you see these pictures on the right, so you have a pretty good understanding of what it means to be in a wetland, but let's talk more specifically. When we talk about a wetland, we're talking about an area that is saturated with water. So that's going to be a key characteristic. And if you look on the right, you see these pictures of areas that are clearly saturated with water. So, that's why we call them wetlands. That makes total sense, all right? So there's a lot of water, and as you can imagine, we're going to often find these next to waterways. And we also might find them in floodplains. So these are these areas saturated with water, and it might be that they're in proximity to waterways or in floodplains. So that makes sense. And there's a lot of different kinds. So we don't want to get too sophisticated here because we're economists, so we're not environmental science people, but we want to be able to interface and understand and be able to talk to the scientists. So we need to have some general understanding. What we do need to appreciate about wetlands is that they play a key role in ecosystems. So they're really important. We don't want to just go around willy-nilly and be destroying wetlands. We don't want to give people permission to interfere with wetlands. We don't want to have housing complexes interfering with the important role that these wetlands play in our ecosystem. You get the idea. Now, one thing that wetlands do is that they help control flooding and erosion. So you can imagine if we eliminate our wetlands, then we are going to have more problems with both flooding and erosion. That's obviously not a good idea. But as you can also imagine, just looking at this picture on the right, wetlands provide important habitat. So imagine, you're kayaking around in this area, you're probably going to see all kinds of different species because this is an important habitat. Add to that our wetlands absorb nutrients that otherwise are going to run off, sediments, other pollutants that otherwise are going to flow into other areas, right? So if we have these wetlands, then they absorb these nutrients and the sediment and other pollutants before they reach the rivers and the lakes. And so that's a very important function that they serve. But of course, add to that the controlling for flooding and erosion, the habitat, the fact that they can absorb the nutrients and sediment and keep these pollutants from reaching rivers and lakes. Obviously, they're also going to be a great site for recreational activities. And so, if you think about all the functions of wetlands, clearly protecting our wetlands is important. I don't have to probably convince you of that. But researchers suggest that protection of our wetlands is even more important in the face of climate change. So, if you're a believer of climate change, wetlands play a very important role. All we're going to do is make things worse if we interfere with our wetlands and the ecosystem services that they provide. Okay, you get the idea. So, let's get back to the topic at hand. When we have development, it can impact wetlands directly. So wetlands can really be interfered with. For example, maybe somebody fills a wetland because they want to create a commercial site or a residential site, because you can fill dirt basically and try to fill in these areas and basically just try to build over them. So we clearly don't want that to happen. We need to make sure that that's not happening. But that's what I mean when I say that development can impact wetlands directly, literally just destroying them, filling them in so that we can proceed with some kind of development. But most of the impact is indirect. So we could theoretically see some direct impact of wetlands if we don't prevent it. But most of the impact is indirect. And it's indirect because it's impacted by activities in other areas. And so we could directly affect them, but most of the impact is indirect, coming from activities in other areas. For example, we could see increased erosion from somebody clearing land. So maybe they're clearing land so that they can build something. And when we have that increased erosion, then we have problems that impact the wetlands. So you might see this increased sedimentation. And so we're talking about kind of the stuff that gets suspended in the water is going to flow into these areas. We also know that wetlands can be impacted by farming, by construction of dams, by industrial discharge. So again, I'm not a scientist. I'm sure that there's tons of people on this campus that could explain this far better than me, but I do want you to appreciate that we see both direct and indirect impacts on wetlands. I want you to appreciate that the bulk of the activities are probably indirect, and I want you to have an appreciation for the important ecosystem services that wetlands provide. All right, you got the idea. Now, you don't get to just develop willy-nilly. Development projects are evaluated for their impact on wetlands. This is just a standard process. So you want to build a big housing complex? Well, you're going to have an evaluation done so we can see how the impacts on wetlands will look like, right? And so if you're a developer, number one, you have to prove that there's no other practical, less damaging approach. In other words, you're required to use the best possible approach. So let's say you've got a situation where there's going to be wetlands affected, and there's no way around affecting the wetlands. You've got to prove that this is the only possible option, that there's no other way for you to proceed without impacting the wetlands. So that's number one. Now, you can still develop most likely, but there's going to be some things you're going to have to do. The second thing is that as a developer, you're going to have to take steps to minimize the impact. So your plan has to be the most practical one, that's the least damaging, and then as you proceed, you have to take steps to minimize the impact. So those are the two things, if you're developing, that you're going to have to check both of those boxes. Now, any project is going to be reviewed. So the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Environmental Quality, they're going to review this big plan for your development project. They're going to look at things like the acres that are impacted, the endangered species that might be impacted. And so you don't get to just, as a commercial developer, buy some huge parcel of land and just go to work. That's not how it works. There's a lot of steps that you have to take. Your plan has to be reviewed. So hopefully that's been made clear. And so now that your plan has been reviewed, we have to make sure that we're meeting the law. And the law requires no net loss. Okay, so in net, when all is said and done, no net loss of wetlands. So we've looked at your plan, and maybe wetlands are going to be affected, but you're going to have to take the steps to make sure there's no net loss, because that's the law. So what does that mean? If there can be no net loss, it means that developers are going to have to take steps to restore wetlands or maybe offset wetlands, whatever it takes. So we're not saying, hey, you can't develop, but when your project is over and done, there can be no net loss of wetlands. So it's going to be your job as a developer to restore, to offset, and make sure that you can meet this law. All right. The good news is that there are different options. So just like with the other market-based strategies we've talked about where there are firms' decisions, same kind of thing is going to be true here, because as a developer, you're going to have different options related to making sure that there's no net loss of wetlands. So a developer who knows we've got a situation, there are wetlands and they're going to be impacted, the developer can first choose to protect a certain number of acres. So maybe I'm developing and I'm just going to set aside a certain amount of land and make sure that there's no impact. So that's obviously one of my options. Of course, that might make my project smaller. It might mean I have to rethink and rescale, but I can set aside acreage and choose to protect it. The second thing that I can do is pay a fee that goes to a group that's doing mitigation work. And what we mean by mitigation work would be restorative work. So I can just protect the acreage myself, A. B, I can pay a fee instead, so it's kind of like paying a tax, and that money is going to get channeled to a group doing mitigation work. They're not doing mitigation work for me, so I'm not saying that you're hiring them. They're just doing it somewhere, and you're basically supporting the activity with your money. So I decide I don't want to protect acres. Instead, I want to pay a fee to this group, and they're going to do some restorative work, and my dollars will be used to help them with that effort. But they're not doing it on my land, so don't confuse that. All right, there's still a third option, though. The third option is to buy credits from a mitigation bank. Buy credits from a mitigation bank. And that's what I want to talk about today, this idea of mitigation banking. So this is kind of like buying pollution allowances under a cap and trade situation from a firm that's not using it. In other words, we talked about, I need to pollute a ton of sulfur dioxide, but I don't have enough allowances. I've got to go then buy one from somebody else. This is akin to that idea. So option C would be buying credits from a mitigation bank. Well, option C might be desirable because it might be the cheapest option. So if you think about these three options, A, I'm setting aside acreage. Well, that changes my project. B, I'm paying a fee to some group who's doing the mitigation work somewhere else. Well, that could be expensive. It depends on the size of the fee. Or I could buy these credits. All right, so those are my three options. But here's the deal. When we talk about buying the credits, we're talking about credits that are created by others. And this is key. These credits only exist because they're created by others. So for there to be credits in a mitigation bank, it's because others are doing things that create the credits. Specifically, others, through their efforts to protect or restore wildlife, they're creating these credits. So in other words, one person might do something to protect the land, create the credits, and now they can sell the credits to this developer. Getting the idea? This is sounding pretty familiar, right? Because it definitely sounds like our tradable pollution allowances. Clearly, this is very similar in structure. All right, so here's the deal. Landowners can undertake protection activities. So maybe you've got a big parcel of land, and you can choose to undertake these protection activities. And the reason you're undertaking these protection activities is to create these credits. So it's a little bit like saying in cap and trade, I'm going to clean up so that I can sell the allowances. Very similar. But instead of cleaning up, we are doing things to protect land. And that creates these credits. And it turns out that different activities are worth different amounts of credits. So as the landowner who wants to get involved in mitigation banking, you can get a sense of, okay, what will this cost me? How much are the credits worth? And you can do your own little analysis to decide, does it make sense for you to be involved in this business? And Longwood's actually involved in this type of activity of creating credits. Now, these credits, as we just talked about, which were just created by the landowners who were doing good things on their land, these credits can be sold to the developers, to the farms, etc. So back to that developer who was going to impact the wetlands, he can go straight to you because you've created these credits and buy those credits. Now, when I say straight to you, I really mean kind of through an intermediary, but I'll show you that too. So again, this is very similar to stuff that we've talked about in class, but the idea here is that people can make money by protecting wetlands. So if you have wetlands on your land and you're protecting them, you can then sell these credits that can be bought by people who need to develop but aren't going to be able to protect the wetlands. All right. Hull Springs Farm, as I said, is involved in this. So Hull Springs Farm is a mitigation bank. And it's actually been doing this for quite a while. And so you see some pictures here on the right. Well, what are we doing at Hull Springs Farm? We're doing things that benefit the environment and creating credits. This whole thing started in 2011. And it started with 22 acres of wetland restoration. So we've got 22 acres of wetlands that got damaged, got just destroyed, which now we're restoring those wetlands. And on top of that, so we've restored 22 acres of wetlands. That creates credits. There are 45 acres of wetland enhancement, and I don't know exactly what that means, so we're kind of improving upon, basically, but I don't know the specifics. But that generates credits. And then there's 85 acres of wetland preservation where the wetland exists and we're basically just kind of taking care of it, and that creates credits. And then add to that we have 23 acres of upland buffer plantings. So I'm going to show you a picture of that in a second, but basically on 23 acres of the farm we have planted stuff, and that helps protect runoff and erosion, those kinds of things. So that's also good for the environment. So we have 22 acres of wetland restoration, 45 acres of wetland enhancement, 85 acres of wetland preservation, 23 acres of upland buffer plantings, and all of these, it's generating credits. So Hull Springs Farm for Longwood University is a source of these credits. Now remember, why would Longwood do this? Because credits can be sold. We understand that. Now, Longwood's also involved in stream and nutrient mitigation banking. So there's two other types of mitigation banking that goes on at Hull Springs Farm. More on that later. Right now, we're just focusing on the wetlands. So what I just told you about the 22 acres plus the 45 acres plus the 85 acres plus the 23 acres, that's all simply related to wetland mitigation banking, and it earns credits. Now, you know, these things earn kind of different kinds of credits. It works a little more sophisticatedly, but basically we're generating these credits that we can sell. So let's take a quick look at this idea of these riparian buffer strips that I had just mentioned. And so here you might have different zones. And so zone 1 on the left, notice that you've got those trees being planted and it's right along the river. Well, when you plant things right there along the river, it's going to prevent and help limit erosion. In fact, as I've traveled around the world, I've seen places where they've cut down the trees and created huge erosion issues. I was in Taman Negara rainforest in Malaysia where they had cut down all the rainforest to make way for farming, and now the water has all this sediment in it from erosion. So in zone 1 you see those trees that are in place, and those are great for helping reduce erosion. And then in zone 2 you've got other kinds of vegetation, and that's going to slow the flow of water. So when these areas get a lot of rain and runoff, and then In zone 3, there's yet other things you can do to the vegetation to pull out the nutrients, things that we don't want flowing into the rivers. Again, I don't know a ton about this, but you understand the idea that these are all things that people have to create. They have to spend some money to make happen. But when they do make it happen, they can sell the credits. All right. Now, it's important to understand that it's hard to get approved for mitigation banking. It's no small feat that Longwood is involved in this. And you're probably not doing it on just a couple acres either, right? So you're talking about big tracts of land. There's probably a whole lot to it to get approved for mitigation banking. But one thing that is interesting, and I'm going to be able to show you this in a moment, that most of these projects in Virginia are private projects. So private companies, private landowners. So it's interesting that Longwood's participation, since we're a public institution, allows for public study of this kind of operation. It would be really hard to study this, with the private projects, but as a public institution, okay, now we've got some interesting opportunities. So Longwood hired a mitigation firm to work with them, and the mitigation firm that they hired is called RES. So when you hear me refer to RES, that's what I'm talking about, this mitigation firm. And they're working with Longwood on all three categories, not just the wetlands. Now, the banked areas that are part of this mitigation bank were originally for farming. And so this was a farm, hence Whole Spring Farm, right? So this was a farm. But now it's a thriving ecosystem. And that thriving ecosystem benefits the Potomac River watershed. And so this is really an important area that obviously any environmental damage in this area is going to go right into the Potomac River watershed. So that's one reason probably that they were able to get approval, because it's got such proximity to the water. And of course, in addition to benefiting the environment, there are direct benefits to Longwood. What are those benefits? Money, right? We generate credits, we can sell the credits. It's not small. And this is important because it's free for classes to use the farm. It's interesting that, any professor can come up with a reason that they want to take their students to Whole Springs Farm, and they can use the facility for free. So some of this money that's being generated helps support the farm and its operations and makes it available to people to use. And so it's really fantastic that we have this. But on top of that, Whole Springs Farm also runs this environmental education program for school-aged children. And so that's fantastic too. So it's not just, the science professors that go and use Whole Springs Farm. It really is anyone, and there are community projects and programs there as well. All right. So as we've already mentioned, you're a developer, you're going to interfere with wetlands, you've got to solve the problem, and there are different ways that you can solve the problem. So remember, you can kind of do it yourself, you can pay this fee for this other restoration group, or you can buy these credits. And as I've already mentioned, buying credits is often the preferred method for developers for multiple reasons. So let's talk about why. And this isn't just for wetland mitigation. Buying these credits for other projects like the nutrients and the lakes and streams, same kind of thing. Buying the credits might be the preferred option. So let's frame this very simply as a choice between buying the credits or undertaking the project yourself. So let's kind of ignore that second option where you could just pay this kind of fee or fine that goes to the restoration group. So you either need to buy credits or you need to undertake the project yourself. Now, I hope you're thinking, okay, wait, that's kind of like the decision process we modeled with tradable pollution allowances, right? Because I either need to buy an allowance or I need to clean up myself. Same kind of deal. So you either have to buy a credit or you have to undertake some kind of wetlands restoration project yourself. Now, if you're buying credits, you're told how many credits that you need to buy. So after the Army Corps looked at your plan and all that stuff, they say, okay, you're going to need to buy 15 credits. I'm just making up a number. But if you know how many credits you need to buy and you can see what they're selling for, then this is a fixed amount of money, right? And if it's a fixed amount of money, then the nice thing for you as a developer is there's no uncertainty. All right, so, maybe it's going to cost you $150,000 in credits, but you're done. There's no uncertainty. However, looking on the right side, if you decide to undertake this project, I should add one more thing before I go on. I should mention that one additional benefit if you just buy the credits, when Longwood hires RES, their mitigation experts, RES assumes the risk. If the projects don't work and they fail to generate credits, that's RES's problem. And there's also no risk to the buyer of the credits. So you're kind of insulated. So you buy these credits, but then it turns out, wait, wetlands aren't really being protected. That doesn't come back to you as the person buying credits. So you need this many credits. It's going to cost you $150,000. You're done. But on the right, moving on now, if you're undertaking a project, well, now you've got to get an initial estimate. And some of these projects could be pretty complex, right? So you're going to start with an initial estimate, but think about it. If you've ever built a house, you always start with this initial estimate, but then you just always run into these additional costs. And so the price isn't really fixed. It's not really uncertain. It's not really, a certainty. There's a lot of uncertainty here. But on top of that, what if the project isn't successful? What if the project's not successful? Well, now it's your problem. So remember, if I buy credits, I don't run any risk. If I undertake the project myself, now I do have risks. If it's a failed project, now I've spent money, and I might have to spend even more money. You get the idea. So if this was up to you, don't you agree that as a developer, buying credits might seem like the way to go? You eliminate your risk. You know how much you have to pay. Very simple. Now, so as long as there's credits, this makes total sense. Now, moving on then. I know that you could fill this part out yourself. You understand that there's a cost-benefit analysis for landowners. So the landowners like Whole Spring Farm. So now we're talking about their decisions. If you're Whole Springs Farm, you've got a choice to make. You need to think about the cost of the mitigation project. So we talked about restoring something like 20-something acres of wetlands, and you've got to figure out, well, gosh, what is the cost of mitigating this? What's the cost of restoring the wetlands? But you can weigh that against the revenue that you're going to make from sale of the credits. And it's pretty easy to see what kind of the market price is for sale of the credits. But it depends, of course, on the price that credits are getting. And that might not be fixed, but you would have a pretty good idea. You'd be able to estimate pretty well what the credits are selling for. So you do a simple cost-benefit analysis and decide, does it make sense for you to proceed? And so for Longwood University, they looked at the cost of these mitigation projects and they compared it to the revenue that they would get from the sale of the credits, and they're like, well, this makes total sense. Let's do this. Now, the price of the mitigation credits is determined by the market. I know you understand this, that supply and demand of these credits determine the market price. Of course, we get that. We're economists. But let's make sure we understand who the players are. When we talk about the demand for credits, this is going to be from people like developers. And these are the developers that need to offset the impacts that they are creating. So they want to build a complex of apartments. They're going to interfere with some wetlands, and now they need to offset that by getting some credits. And the suppliers, let me go back. The suppliers are going to be the landowners like Whole Springs Farm who are completing the projects. So the ones who create the credits, obviously they're the suppliers. So between supply and demand, we're going to have a market price. So let's say the market price is P1. But what's interesting is we see some really high growth areas. So in high growth areas, demand could go up. So obviously we know what to do here. If demand goes up to the red demand curve, and if I had labeled everything, we would see that price would go up, right? So, as it says in this yellow box, in our high growth areas where demand is higher, price is higher. And here's the thing, this is important, make sure you understand this. You have to buy credits within region. So if your credits are more expensive, the developers in your region do not have a choice. They have to pay it. They cannot get a better price by going outside of the region. So Hull Springs Farm is in a certain region, and if a developer wants to build there, he can't now go look at Southern Virginia and get his credits there where they're cheaper. That is not one of his options. So let's look at some data that I found, and I found this graph. This is wetland mitigation credit values, and this is obviously going over time. And this is, I think, an average across states. This is not just for Virginia. But what we see is that the wetland mitigation credit prices, well, they're on the rise. So they've been kind of steadily increasing if we look at the trend between 1990 and 2019. So if you've gotten into the wetland mitigation business, this is good news for you. So private companies are the ones that sell these credits. So this is all handled, the supply and demand, the exchange is all handled by private companies. They're the ones that sell, that actually do the selling of the credits to the buyers. And you can actually find brokers on the internet. So I had a little fun looking at this. And so remember I told you about this mitigation company, RES. RES is both the mitigation firm, they're the ones working with the mitigation projects, and they're the broker for the Longwood credits. So understand what this means. That means that RES is helping design and implement the mitigation projects, but they're also the ones that sell the credits for Longwood University. And so one thing that I asked when I was hearing about this, I asked, hey, is this a conflict of interest? Because obviously Longwood's not their only client. So let's say they have 5 clients. How do they decide whose credits to sell first? Because maybe they have Longwood University and they have 3 other clients who are private companies, private landowners, and now somebody wants to buy credits from RES. Do they sell them Longwood's credits? Do they sell them somebody else's credits? No one could answer that question. But I would love to know the answer. I just could never get one. So again, if you have multiple suppliers in a region, how do you decide? Do you sell Longwood's credits first? Do you sell one of your other clients' credits first? I don't know. So again, to me, it seems like there's some potential conflicts of interest, not accusing them of anything. I just think it's interesting and I'm curious. I'd love to know more, but no one has been able to answer my questions. So let's look at what this would look like on the website. So this is RES, and you can see if I wanted, I could come here and say, hey, buy credits, and search out all the projects. So I did, and I found Hull Springs Farm Mitigation Bank right there. And of course, there's a person assigned, whoever Caitlin Parker is, but there's her phone number. So if somebody was interested in credits, buying them from Hull Springs Farm Mitigation Bank, they would know who to contact. And then this is the national tracking system called RIBITS, and it's the Regulatory In Lieu Fee and Bank Information Tracking System. It's not that important that we understand what that stands for. Just understand when I talk about RIBITS, I'm talking about a national program, and so I played around here as well and found more for this region. And if you look, again, they all say private, 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 private. They are all private. So as I said, for Longwood University to be involved in mitigation banking, that's a pretty interesting idea because we're a public entity and normally we see private. So again, wetland mitigation banking, we understand the idea. We understand that it's another example of market-based strategies for environmental protection. So we understand that there are clear parallels to that acid rain reduction program. We called it our tradable pollution allowance program, right? The sulfur dioxide with the U.S. power plants that we talked about in the Clean Air Act. But the idea here is that developers are given options. And when you're given options, then you can decide what the best option is for you, right? So we agree that this is market-based because you get to make decisions and things are going to be dictated by the market. The price is going to be dictated by the market. It's clearly not a command and control strategy, other than there are regulations that say no net loss of wetlands. So you're going to have to meet that. You're not allowed to have a net loss of wetlands, but outside of that, your way of meeting that requirement is up to you. The nice thing here, as we've been talking about in our other examples with ITQs and tradable pollution allowances, is that this is going to address the problems in the least cost manner, right? Because if it's cheapest for developers to buy credits, then that's what they're going to do. And they're creating the same kind of benefits because somebody else has to restore the wetlands. So Longwood restores the wetlands and the developer unfortunately destroys some wetlands. No net loss, but the price tag is lower. So this keeps development costs from being artificially higher. So you might be thinking, well, why do we care about doing this at the least cost manner? Well, remember, developers are building houses, they're building apartments. If those costs are inflated, that comes back to you and me. So when we keep the cost of development as efficient as possible, when we keep it from being artificially high because we have these command and control strategies, that's good for you and me. That means housing prices are going to be more reasonable than they might be if there were all these other additional costs. Now, we can also talk about efficiency with respect to the investment in mitigation projects, right? So just like we were talking about who does the cleanup, who catches the fish, same idea with efficiency in that those landowners who can mitigate in a cost-effective manner, they're the ones that are going to do so, right? Think about Longwood University. Why are they involved? Because they've determined they can do it at a cost-effective enough manner so that they can make profits when they sell the credits. If it was going to be super, super high cost for Longwood University, they aren't going to be involved. So remember, the landowners who can mitigate in an efficient manner, cost-effective manner, they're the ones that are going to make the money from selling the credits. So they're the ones that are going to undertake these activities, right? But those landowners who can't mitigate in a cost-effective manner, well, if you're a landowner who can't mitigate cost-effectively, then do you agree you're not going to do it? It wouldn't make sense. If it's going to be highly expensive for you to restore wetlands on your land, you're not going to be able to recoup the costs from selling the credits. So you're not going to be involved. So do you see, we kind of naturally sort ourselves out into ones where it makes sense to restore wetlands on this land, but it might not make sense to restore wetlands over here. We're going to restore them where it can be done in the most cost-effective manner. And that means we're going to have the most efficient projects being undertaken. And that's a good thing, right? The most efficient projects are going to be undertaken. Now, one important distinction that we need to make with the acid rain program we've been talking about. So remember, we've been talking about tradable pollution allowances. Well, in the tradable pollution allowance program that we talked about with the electric utility companies with sulfur dioxide, here's something important. Pollution permits, I should say allowances, pollution allowances can be sold state to state. So if you look at my map over here on the right, theoretically, California could sell allowances to Virginia. So if California sold allowances to Virginia, then what happens? We have pollution that would have taken place in California, and now that pollution is moving to Virginia. So theoretically, under our tradable pollution allowance program, pollution could be exported to other states. Turns out we don't really see that, but theoretically, pollution allowances can be sold from one state to the other, which means the pollution leaves one state and basically enters another one. As I said, data suggests that's not happening, but it could, theoretically. So we want to understand that. But with the wetland mitigation credits that we've been talking about, remember with wetland credits, as I've already mentioned, they must stay in the region. So they must stay in the region. So what that means is we don't have a net increase or a net decrease in any area, right? So we don't have wetlands being destroyed in California but restored in North Carolina, right? That wouldn't really make any sense. We want to kind of keep the wetlands where they were, right? So if we destroy them in this region, they need to be rebuilt in the same region. Another interesting thing for Longwood, it's good news, is that Longwood is in a super hot market. So they're in a market that includes Fredericksburg. And Fredericksburg is an area of high growth. So think about it, guys. If Fredericksburg's in the region and it's growing a lot, then that means developers want to be operating there and they're going to need credits. So why is that good news for Longwood? Demand for credits is going to go up. More development means more credits are needed. So demand goes up, we get a better price. That's all there is to it. So Longwood really is being very successful right now with this mitigation banking idea. It's really cool, and it's made a lot of money. So again, we don't need to know this map specifically, but this is from the DEQ, and it's showing you these kind of regions, these river basins. So the idea is that damage a wetland in the yellow area, restore the wetland in the yellow area. So we don't trade them out of region. All right, now we understand wetland mitigation and the idea of creating these credits that can be sold. Now we're going to talk about stream restoration credit banking. Guys, I don't have a lot to say because it basically works the same way, but I want to throw it out there. And specifically, we're talking about credits for mitigation of streams. So damage that happens to streams, we need to fix streams. So we damage some and we improve others. That's the idea. Same kind of design of the program. So if development is impacting streams, which sometimes it does, then as a developer, you're going to have to get stream credits. So just like there are wetland credits, there are stream credits. So if you're impacting wetlands, then you have to have wetland credits. So they're very specific. Credits are very specific in terms of what kind of environmental damage we're talking about. So Longwood is involved in wetland credit banking, and they're also involved in the stream credit market as well. Interestingly, stream credits are cheaper. So that's per one of my science colleagues. And so this gives developers an incentive to redesign their projects. So maybe if you're a developer and you know wetland credits are more expensive, but stream credits are cheaper, so think about it strategically, you might ask yourself, can I redesign my project? If stream credits are cheaper, then maybe we suffer through impacting some streams, but we're going to leave the wetlands alone. So I could redesign my project to limit the impact on wetlands and instead focus on streams. But it's hard to avoid the impact on streams. So I can probably work around the wetlands, but I'm going to affect some streams. And that might be an okay trade-off, given that from the developer standpoint, they can get the stream credits a lot cheaper. So you get the idea. But it's similar programs, stream credits, wetland credits, they're going to work the same way. Now, as I said, Hull Springs Farm is involved in stream credit restoration projects that result in these credits. So they're involved in these credit banks as well for streams. So we've got wetlands and we've got streams. Now, wetland banking is interesting because wetlands are measured on an acre basis, but streams are measured in linear feet, right? It would be kind of weird to think about acres of streams because sometimes they're narrow. So when we talk about wetlands, the credits are going to be for a certain amount of acreage. When we talk about streams, it's going to be for a certain amount of linear feet. Why do I need to share this with you? Because it doesn't seem that important, other than I want to share with you the data for Longwood, and you need to understand how I'm measuring them. So Longwood has 1,454 feet of stream restoration, right? That is a lot of feet. And it's got 6,012 feet of stream enhancement and preservation, right? So we're talking about different levels of activity, restoring versus improving. And as I said, they can sell these credits as well. Works very similarly to wetland credits. So, wetland credits, stream credits. Our last category of credits is nutrients. So, nutrient banking. Third program that Longwood is involved in through Hull Springs Farm is nutrient credits. So, the banking of nutrient credits. So, again, same kind of deal. It's a credit-based program. But these credits are created when farmers convert their land. So, remember, Hull Springs Farm was a farm. Now it's not. So credits are created when farmers choose to convert their land from crop or hay production to land that's going to remain basically untouched. So basically you're choosing to set aside your agricultural operations, right? And let your land just kind of go back to natural. So that creates nutrient banking. Now, why are we calling this nutrient banking? Why are we calling this, a nutrient credit? Well, that's because if you're a farmer and you've given up farming, imagine that this reduces the use of chemicals like fertilizer, pesticides, and so this is basically a program where you're encouraged to stop activities that are harmful for the environment through use of fertilizer and pesticides. You get the idea. Now, again, these credits are awarded by the Commonwealth of Virginia through the Department of Environmental Quality, and Longwood is involved in this type of banking too. It's interesting to learn that Longwood used to rent out the land to another farmer. So when we got the farm, the first thing we did to make money was just rented the land to another farmer. That's a really common thing. That often farms are rented to other farmers. But then we realized that it would be better for us to end that practice. So we did. We let the land regenerate into its natural state. And of course, because we're part of this nutrient mitigation program, we receive credits for this as well. I was able to find out that the value to Longwood for the nutrient banking is $1 million. So that's a lot of money. I wasn't able to find too much information on the total generation of revenue, but it seems like it's quite a bit. So again, I don't want to belabor this because I know you understand the big picture. We're almost done here. But I do want to make sure that you can always explain back to me the kind of cost-benefit analysis that would have to take place if you're a farmer. So if you're a farmer and you have land, you can look on the left and say, okay, there's going to be money gained when I set aside my farmland because I can participate, if I get approved, I can participate in this nutrient banking program. So I let my land go wild, I sell off the credits and make money. But I also have to remember that there's going to be money lost from the foregone sales of crops, right? When I stop farming, I also lose money. So I have to figure out what makes more sense for me. Would it make sense for me to stop farming and get involved in nutrient banking or not? So in one example, and this is from 2015, I found this one from VDOT, the Virginia Department of Transportation, and they reported that the use of offset credits was very economical for them, that they were saving taxpayers huge amount of money by being able to use credits. In fact, it was half of the cost of the alternative engineered practices that they traditionally use. So in other words, rather than trying to mitigate themselves, they could buy credits, cut the cost in half. So that seems like a really good thing because somebody else more economically can restore the environment. So again, we're not talking about a net loss of environmental practices and protection. It's just being done somewhere else. Remember, when VDOT saves money, that's good for all of us, right? Because it's taxpayers paying the bill. So VDOT being able to participate in buying of credits resulted in a huge cost saving to taxpayers. So let's quickly wrap it up. We've talked about 3 different mitigation programs. We've talked about wetland banking, stream banking, and nutrient banking. And hopefully you appreciate that they all work the same way. And I also hope that you appreciate that there are parallels to what we've discussed in class. So hopefully you understand how this is similar to the acid rain reduction program with the Clean Air Act, again, the tradable pollution allowance program with the sulfur dioxide. I might expect you to be able to pull those 2 things together and talk about that. So please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much for your attention, guys. I hope you have a fantastic day.